Welcome, everybody. My name is Roy Rogers, and it's my distinct privilege today to help present a program of traditional Scottish music from the 18th century. To do that, I have two mighty musicians, Hugh Cheape on Scottish small pipes, and Paul Jordan on the fiddle. I think first I'd like to find out for the viewers what it is that brings you to Philadelphia. Hugh is the curator of the National Museums of Scotland, one of the curators. You're the curator in charge of the Scottish collections, as they're called, yes. Right? Yeah. And Paul is one of the founders and administrator of the Scottish Fiddle Orchestra. So why are you here in Philadelphia at this time?
Well, we're on a tour between New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, promoting the Museum of Scotland and the National Museums of Scotland and our work in Scotland, and celebrating our links with America. And so we thought we'd plug onto that tour some musical performances.
Well, with regard to your musical program, I know you're calling it migrating music. So could you tell us a little bit about the individual pieces that you think you'll be performing?
Yes, well, we started with one called A Dance Called America, which we call A Dance Called America, because it's almost the beginning of the story in terms of the historical record, where travellers in the Highlands in the 1770s noticed this big change happening in society, in the communities, and people on the move. And in particular, this well-known writer in Scotland, James Boswell, who travelled the Highlands with Dr. Samuel Johnson, who was a very brusque and overbearing Englishman. And they saw this dance being done, and they used it as a kind of metaphor for emigration. And they described how the dance was done and people moving around in circle and moving off to one side. And he likened it, as it were, to the whole business of the countryside in motion and moving abroad, described as a dance called America. And it's been very much brought to the fore in the last 10 years or so, when there was a Gaelic rock group called Run Rig who played A Dance Called America, but to their own music. But it woke us up to the existence of this information. And then another very well-known historian in Scotland, James Hunter, wrote a book called A Dance Called America. So I thought I must go back to see what was this dance called America. So we've located the music, so to speak. It appears in the Neil Gow's fiddle collection of the 1790s, and it's called the American Reel. And then in doing our research, we discovered there was a Gaelic song to it, Anul Harnanelanan America Gontaichin. And that literally means, over the islands to America we shall go. And of course, the words match the music so exactly. But they also remind us that words and song were used as a form of mouth music in Scotland, as I'm sure they were in America. And in fact, maybe that's a good avenue of research, that what will appear in Appalachia and Tennessee is mouth music, more mouth music, or evidence for mouth music. So it all begins to mold together. The music, the dance, the Gaelic song, and so forth, and the different versions of it. So we start off with that.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind demonstrating a little bit of the mouth music that you're talking about?
I'm not really a singer, but maybe if I'll recite it. Anul Harnanelanan America Guntaichin Anul Harnanelanan America Guntaichin Anul Harnanelanan America Guntaichin Shears Rat. I can't remember it. Dearie me.
Yeah.
but the words are there.
Yes.
And they do tell a story, but they're also slightly nonsensical. Mm-hmm. They're like what I think the scholars call vocables.
Right. But the other important point is that in the worst of times in the villages, something like a fiddle or something as expensive as the pipes might not be available.
Exactly.
And therefore
mouth music was what was to hand. Yes. Very much in everybody's mind. And there was a ready match between words and music, and the words recalled the music, and the music recalled the words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a sort of dynamic, if you like.
Mhm.
Yeah. And we're very lucky in that Gaelic mouth music, Push the Bial, is very much alive in Scotland. So, I mean, it's literally as simple as when I was doing this research, I rang a friend of mine in the island of Lewis in the Hebrides, and I said, "Do you know anything about a dance over the Isles to America? Do you know?" "Oh yes," she said. "Oh yes," and sang it down the phone just like that. So, you know, there was Johnston Boswell hearing it in 1773, and you can lift the phone to Stornoway in the Isle of Lewis today, and someone will sing it to you just like that.
Nice. Isn't that
So
something? Yeah.
the tradition is very much alive.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
The second piece is a pibroch, I understand.
Yes, it's quite a complicated piece because we found the most ready evidence for emigrant music was information, references to a song called I Will Never Return. And of course, I knew immediately that that was also the title of a Gaelic pibroch for the bagpipes, a Highland bagpipe lament. And I knew also that there was a very well-known tradition behind that, that it was a song composed by the piping teacher and performer in the island of Skye, one of the MacCrimmons, Donald Ban MacCrimmon, at the time of the 1745, when on the point of departure to join the government forces, he had a vision of his own death in the action. And he sung this song, and he performed it, he composed this pibroch. Or at least I suspect he sung the song, and it was translated into pipe music. And it was said to be the song of emigrants because of the note of I will never return. And I am departing across the sea, which is the essence of the song. And but what makes the issue slightly suspect is that Sir Walter Scott picked up this in the turn of the 19th century and produced his own version of it in startling English prose, or poetry, I should say, and a very strong evocation of mood, mist-covered mountains, the banshee wailing, and the sorrowing people departing across the sea. But I'm not so sure, at least I think we can be sure that this was not historical fact, but it was the literary artistry of the day, and that Sir Walter Scott produced this I Will Never Return. And so this idea became embedded that any account of emigrants had to include this reference to I Will Never Return. But we've picked it up because we think there is more virtue in it than literary artifice of the time of Sir Walter Scott, that we think that it was indeed played, that its very character as a lament with its repetitive musical phrases and its words, Chachil, Chachil, Chachil mi tulug, I will never return. And then the concluding line, Get the hik MacLeod, Chachik, Macrimmon. Though MacLeod will return, the chieftain, Macrimmon will never return. And so the other factor, this is getting very complicated, but there's a number of layers of evidence and interpretation. The fact that it was picked up in a late 18th century fashion for what were called fiddle pibrochs, where pibroch music was taken into fiddle music and played on the fiddle in quite formal drawing room performances in the towns. But that is important because it's been a means of preserving this element of the pibroch as song and as instrumental music, as apart from the most evidence we have from it in Scotland is as a very, very formal classical Highland bagpipe music. And undoubtedly, we know these days that it's become stylized and it's actually lost this link with song and dance.
I see. We're using this word pibroch, and just so everyone is clear, it's Gaelic for...
It's Gaelic actually simply for piping, but it's been adopted these days as to mean the classical music of the bagpipe. Slow performance pieces, as I say, very stylized, very structured.
Yes.
And in Gaelic, people talk about ceol mór, meaning big music, ceol mór, and as opposed to light music, ceol bic, little music. But it's become a convention just to talk about pibroch.
I see. My understanding is there's still room in the pibroch tradition for individual expression. There's more room in the pibroch than there is in the marching band tradition, or the
definitely because the individual is playing. But it's only now in the last 10 years that the whole thing is actually loosening up, and that the individual is allowed to express him or herself, because it is a fact, as pipers, the piping community recognizes, as the playing of pibroch had become very much locked into a competition style in which there was no individual expression, and individual expression was disallowed, frowned on. You had to play it to a set-piece formula, and by playing it to that set-piece formula, it had become atrophied, really. It had become fixed, and we now realize that it lacks spirit and feeling. So I think that there is meant to be a silent lesson in us adopting this "I will never return" into the program, in that the fiddle pibroch, the fiddle music, and the pibroch song background can perhaps come out.
Interesting. Let me ask you, Paul, are you, as the fiddler, are you expected to mimic a lot of piping techniques on your playing?
Especially when I'm with Hugh, yes. He teaches me the intricacies of piping, ornamentation, which I wouldn't normally particularly do.
You wouldn't normally do that. I see.
I would do a more fiddle ornamentation, but on close listening to Hugh, I adapt. Yeah.
How about that?
But I think the Scottish fiddle tradition, though, does have a lot of piping.
I think there are a lot of
technique.
cross references.
Because I mean, the thing is that we've taken up to playing together without any particular great tutorial period or difficult learning. I mean, I listen to you, and presumably you listen to me. Yeah, that's right. And so the thing, we do try and it grows together. But I think Paul's being a bit hard on himself. That. I mean, I'm sure he does adapt, but I think I would have said that I recognise a lot of piping technique and stylistic detail in his playing anyway.
But, yeah, I mean, we listen to each other and come up with a whole new system. No, not really. We do. We just it just blends together. On listening to each other.
So you have to work in those crayons, Your next group of tunes is dance tunes. Is that right?
Yes.
A Strathbay and
Strathbay and two reels.
Two reels.
although we try and play it in a style that's more 18th century, where perhaps the strathspey is less pointed than they played today, and is a bit more rounded, and that the reel is perhaps just ever so slightly slower, so the two flow into each other better, because I think that's where there's a very solid piece of evidence for us from North America.
Hugh, why don't you tell us, please, what other tunes you're going to be performing in the program?
Well, the third set is a dance set. The strathspey, the slow dance, is called Miss Drummond of Perth, but behind it lies a Gaelic song, Callum Crupoch Siglean, or Engile Crupoch Siglean, meaning the lame lad of the glen, and there's a very amusing song behind it about sheep stealing. And two more reels, Christmas Carousal, with also a Gaelic title, which shows that this was with the first words of the song. And finally, a tune, The Man in the Moon, with a Gaelic title, Donald the Gaelic, meaning Donald of the Moon, kind of proverbial, but also, I think, telling us that there's a song behind it.
Okay.
And this is traditional music from the 18th century in Scotland. Can you tell us a little bit about the music itself?
Well, the music has been selected because we wanted to investigate for our own interest what music might have gone across with emigrants to America in the 18th and early 19th century. So we had set ourselves a very strict limit that it really had to be before 1800 and would have been the sort of music that had come across. And as far as we could try and find out if there was evidence for it here. And we assume that it's a portable culture and would come across readily, and so that an instrument such as small pipes and fiddle would be the sort of music it was performed on. And we've done quite a lot of research over the last 6 months or so, and so it's quite speculative. So any feedback we get, we'd be very pleased.
Mm-hmm. And in the conversations that you and I have had, you have a really interesting perspective on how so much of the Scottish music that they brought over in the 18th century wound up being absorbed and transformed into American country music.
Well, I think I'm feeling my way towards this thesis, but I heard a very good program last year that was made up with recordings from the Library of Congress, and it was really about the emergence of country music in the States, particularly Appalachia, the southern states, and ending up as anything from gospel music to Nashville. And I was really very struck that certainly by the late 19th and early 20th century, say up to the 1930s, when the big band scene took over, that country music itself drew very strongly on Scottish music, Scotch-Irish music, and say French-Acadian music.
Yeah,
so I'm feeling my way towards this, and I would like to think that maybe if we're able to play this music across here, it chimes with people and ring bells and maybe awakes memories.
That's very interesting. And I was very surprised to learn that the Scottish migration started so early, started in the 1700s.
Yes, it did. And we know about it, obviously, in quite some detail from, say, the time of the Jacobite Rebellion, 1745-46, which having had a civil war, obviously a lot of people moved off after that. But what we're really interested in the time for which there is evidence of what went with people, what people took. And the 1770s particularly is a time when we learn more about the dynamics of emigration, why people were leaving, and it was particularly to do with social change in the Highlands and rise in rents, people not able to pay their rents anymore, being basically forced off the land. And that process gathered speed till it became what's known as the Highland clearances in the 19th century. And it's the way that process began and continued and ended up. And we were in Ellis Island last week to open a small exhibition for the National Museums on emigration. And that was really perhaps the end of the story, the crowds of people coming in the late 19th century, the victims of the clearances. But we find that the period for which there's most evidence is of music, for example, and oral culture is the late 18th century.
I see. And you mentioned, again in our conversations, something that was interesting, how the Scottish immigrants became more dispersed through a rural America at the time, as opposed to other groups that came later, the Irish and the Italians, that concentrated in more populated urban centers.
Well, I think that's one reason why it's actually difficult to pin down the Scottish tradition in America, and I think that's why we've got to perhaps analyse it through country music and move back. But certainly, as far as we know, the dynamics of migration into America of Scots, they would come into, say, Philadelphia, and move off south, and either end up in Piedmont, I think, in the Low Country on the coast, in the Carolinas, but most went along the Blue Ridge Trail and out on the frontier and into Tennessee. And so I think that the Scottish groups and families and communities were very much dispersed. But we really assume that they did take their music with them. And it's a matter of trying to find out where it went and how it melted down into the American scene. The next set is Jenny Nettles and Willie Was a Wanton Wag. These are very interesting because they're probably 17th century tunes. Behind it again lies a song. In this case, Jenny Nettles is a sad song about a girl who's been jilted but has been left with a baby. And the father, I might say, is castigated in the song, is given a very hard time, quite rightly. And the girl, we are told in the song, is censured by the community and by the church. And Willie Was a Wanton Wag is about a man at a wedding an older man who fancies himself and goes off with the bride, and the bridegroom gets pushed out of the picture. Okay.
Paul, you and I were talking about how you want to try and preserve this music, that it's being subject to something of a dilution for modern influences right now. Is this a lot of this in your program is dance music? Is this music being danced to today in your home in, say, Edinburgh or a city like Glasgow?
Yeah, so there's many balls and grand dances that still take place throughout Scotland, especially in Edinburgh, being the capital. There's a big sort of argument in their own minds, as to what traditional music sounded like, when at the time it was composed, how it was performed at that time, and are we performing it that way now, in the same style, or do we put a modern influence on the performance? So there's lots of arguments as to what it should sound like.
Yeah, we get a lot of those arguments. My background is in traditional Irish music, and we get all those arguments that
as well.
Whether a bouzouki should be, part of traditional Irish music, or even the banjo. Some people don't even like the banjo being played in Irish music. But it is still danced to at say Céilís or weddings or
both those things.
Social events,
big social events.
It's still very much knitted to the social fabric of the Scottish people.
Absolutely, and probably on an upsurgence currently, more popular now than it has been in the last few decades. Yeah.
I want you to tell me a little bit about the Scottish Fiddle Orchestra. When I first met you, I made a crack that when you say a fiddle orchestra, I picture 50 fiddlers sitting up on stage and performing all at once, and your response was, well, actually, it's over 100.
That's right. Just double it. We have a membership of about 130, made up of mostly fiddle players. We have about 90 on stage at any one time, and we perform traditional music or music in the traditional way. And we have some singers with us usually, and some solo items, which makes up a good night's entertainment.
Are they singing in Scottish Gaelic by any chance?
Quite often, yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. That must be quite a sight. 90 fiddlers sawing away at once.
It is, yes. Yeah. You need to look out for us on one of the PBS channels. I'm sure you'll come across it somewhere.
Yeah. And why? What is the purpose of such an orchestra?
The main aim is to spread the traditional music of Scotland to as wide an audience as possible, and to bring enjoyment along the way, which is what all the members in the orchestra are there for. No other reason.
I see. I see.
The next set is The Lads with the Kilt and The Thief of Lochaber. Solid 18th century tunes. The Lads with the Kilt commemorates the raising of the Highland regiments for the French and Indian War and for the American War of Independence. And it's Gaelic song Gillian and Ailey, the Lads of the Kilt, straight translation. And the song celebrates the Highlanders for their prowess with weapons, the perpetuation of their fame and the renown of their ancestors and so on. And The Thief of Lochaber is also known as Macfarlane's tune, or Macfarlane's favourite. And it's very curious because Lochaber is very much in the heart of the Highlands, and it was known to be a den of thieves. So the Thief of Lochaber, it's either this was the very worst thief in a den of thieves, or there was only one thief ever in Lochaber. So there's a nice little conundrum there. And it's a jig.
Okay.
Yeah, I would really like to see that. Now, I understand, before we delve into this contraption over here, I understand that this is a most venerable musical instrument that you have here.
Today I'm playing on it's an old Italian instrument. It was made in 1774, so that makes it 228 years old this year. And it's a lovely instrument to play on.
Mm-hmm.
Makes life a bit easier. Plays its own music.
Marvelous.
Yeah.
Italian. Do you know who the maker was?
Castello was the maker.
Uh-huh.
He was based in Genoa, northern Italy.
I see. So, when I say that we're going to have a piper on the program, you have to admit that this is not quite the picture that comes to most people's minds. So, you're going to have to explain yourself a little bit.
Well, I think that is important, that it's not the picture that comes to everybody's minds, because the picture is one of a kilted Highlander with a big set of Highland bagpipes.
Indeed.
And that is a kind of stereotype which we're beginning to question back home in Scotland. It's one that's emerged perhaps in the Victorian era and in the days of the British Empire. And what we do know is that, say, before 1850, bagpipes were very varied in Scotland, as they were as in England even, and in parts of the continent. And there were many different sizes and shapes of bagpipes. And this is certainly one of the family of Scottish bagpipes, because we have a lot of evidence for and a lot of instruments which show that there were at least 3 types of instrument existing in Scotland up to about 1850. The Highland bagpipe, the Lowland bagpipe, and the chamber bagpipe, or small pipe. And this is the last of these, the chamber bagpipe. Good for playing indoors, bellows blown, so you could go on playing for much longer, I hope. And the dry wind from bellows it keeps the reeds much more settled, whereas the Highland bagpipes, the humidity of the breath and the saliva unsettles the reeds all the time. Tuning and setting reeds in the Highland bagpipe is time consuming, and so this is a bit neater.
Could you do me a favor and make the bellows a little bit more prominent? You say it's bellows blown. I don't
Yes,
think
here you are.
a lot of people will understand exactly what that means.
Here you are. I strap my right arm into it here.
Yes.
It's like the Ulian pipes in Ireland and the Northumbrian pipes and some European bagpipes. I think the Bulgarian bagpipe has bellows. I think it's a kind of Renaissance, kind of Baroque adaptation
I see.
on bagpipes. An attempt to turn a kind of rough country instrument into an orchestral performing instrument.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, I mean, they were often called chamber pipes, or a nice vernacular name for them back home is cold wind pipes, as opposed to hot wind from the breath.
Yeah. Very nice.
So, bellows strapped around the waist. Here's the strap.
Yep.
Oh, that's my belt. That's the strap. And you pump it with the right elbow. So Ulian pipes means elbow pipes, for example,
Indeed.
in Irish.
Okay.
So
It's a lovely sound. It's a lovely, as opposed to what most people are more familiar with, the Highland pipes, which oftentimes is classified as a weapon of war, and maybe to be played outside. And
it's vigorous and robust noise, sound, I should say. Yes, and this is lower pitched and quieter, obviously, and we can set the chanter to be tuned in A, which means it's happier playing with the fiddle.
and the chanter's where the melody comes from.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. Standard octave scale with +1 note.
Indeed.
No keys on it. It seems that Scotland resisted adding keys to the chanter. It's an interesting consideration. In Ireland, the chanter was expanded, up to 7 or 10, maybe 12 keys to give a fully chromatic scale. And Northumbrian pipes also expanded, but the Scottish pipes didn't. It's almost Scotland a bit further out, a bit more thorough to old traditions.
I see. That's it's interesting. Yeah. That's interesting. And the drones fall across your right wrist there, as opposed to going up
they could go over your shoulder, but it's more convenient to have them across your right arm. 3 drones.
Are they all A, or is there one?
No,
D
there's one E.
Oh, E?
Yes, 2 A's and an E. In other words, 2 tonics
that's
and
very
a
nice.
dominant. And sometimes I haven't closed off the the dominant today, but you might close it off. It might be a bit heavy on tunes in a different key. So there's a little plug in the top there, which you can close it off. And these plugs are also useful for helping for tuning, because tuning is quite delicate.
It's fascinating. It's a lovely, beautiful sound. Very.
This is a copy of a late 18th century, early 19th century instrument. But very few old bagpipes survive in playing condition. So it's better to use an old one as it were, a plan and a document for building a new one to the old pattern.
Sure.
Which we've done. And there's a lot of makers doing it in Scotland now. It's becoming very popular. Because it's a good ensemble instrument.
Great.
The next song is Tulloch Gorum, a strathspey, which was an old instrumental tune in the 18th century, but became a bit of a hit because a well-known poet wrote a political squib to it at the time. And so it came back into fashion because it became the tune for a well-known song at the time, which poked fun at politicians. So maybe we should be composing more songs poking fun at politicians these days. The next set are again dance tunes. The back of the change house, cool and tai oster in Gaelic, means at the pub, behind the pub. Carastina Caimble, a song about that I will marry this girl, Carastina Caimble, and the punchline is that I will marry her though she has skinny legs, because it's a well-known fact that in Gaelic tradition it's anathema. Skinny legs are anathema. So. It's a song, a fun song, poking fun at people.
Take 3. Why are we doing Athol Highlanders? I suppose it was a popular piece of music,
popular
at
tune
that time.
in the late 18th, early 19th century, and it chimes particularly with what we know about customs and traditions of dancing, particularly in Athol, which is a valley in the centre of the Highlands. A rich tradition of dancing and community activity. And the final tune has escaped our memory. But it's a good one.
A wife's a wanton wee thing.
That's right. My wife's a wanton wee thing. What you'll notice that as you go back into the 18th century, the naming of tunes is nice and down to earth. And you get in the 19th century, a lot of these tunes are jazzed up a bit, are changed, restyled, and they're also given new titles, which are perhaps more polite. So, for example, Willie was a wanton wag, which is really an entertaining title, down-to-earth one, is renamed as Happy We've Been Are Together, which is a bit of a skewing the story because it's used for weddings, but it loses the story that Willie had gone off with the bride.
Mm-hmm. The Victorian influence starts
Yes.
to creep in. Yeah, interesting.
And the final reel is Halian dør Gillen, meaning the ale is expensive, the beer is expensive, the ale is dear. The final song is Al Gangne Mer til Jon Tun, which is a well-known 18th century song published in several collections and is really a statement by the fiddler or piper who've been thrown out of town for misbehaving, that they'll not go back to that town where they had such rotten treatment. And is very typical of instrumentalists. But I must say that Al Gangne Mer til Jon Tun doesn't in any way express our sentiments about Philadelphia.